I thought it'd be really clever. I'm using my little microphone,
Yeah, it
so do
sounds
I sound
great.
okay? Nothing. It's nothing like problematic in the
That's right.
background.
No, let's see. No,
Okay.
no. I think they'll just go ahead and dive right in. Uh,
Okay.
Australian born, Glasgow based, honestly, two of my favorite accents ever combined into one, which is a horrible way to start, but I have to say it anyway. Thank you so much for joining me today. We met on another podcast and we were able to connect. I'm so glad that we have some time just one on one here. I know at your position with the University of Glasgow, you do a lot of lecturing, but you're also incredibly active as a composer. In fact, you just had an album released of all your own music. Is that right?
Yes. So back at the end of July, a my first portrait CD album came out on Delphian Records, and so that featured a number of chamber pieces of mine, which I wanted to showcase going back over the last 10 years. And that featured performances by the Hermes Experiment and Red Note Ensemble. So Red Note Ensemble are a Scottish-based, Scotland-based ensemble, contemporary new music specialists, and the Hermes Experiment are a British-based ensemble. Um,
Yeah, I got to listen to some of those, and it sounds fantastic. Really, really fun to hear. I'm wondering if you can explain a little of what you mean by the audible preoccupation with gesture, which I believe is how you've been describing at least some of your more recent music as having that characteristic.
yes. So it reflects that over time, I've become more aware or focused in my composing on thinking about gestural shapes. And rather than building things up from the bottom or thinking about notes and building from notes, it's more about just the sort of the top down idea about shapes that I'm creating. So from a sort of a composing point of view, I'm building my music from gestural sort of awareness, and so I hear that coming across in the result when I reflect upon what I've done. So it's an audible preoccupation with gesture, um, and so that's I suppose how I invite listeners to approach my music as well as to inevitably think about what they hear and how that maybe relates to something extra musical, something in the environment, something that's bodily. So there's some sort of resonance with the listener.
So would I be correct in framing it this way that it's not just what's happening in the music siloed onto itself, but how it's perceived from the listener. So that would be very individualistic depending on who's listening and how they might translate that to a physical response with the actual physical resonance or their past experiences with other art forms or even life specific non-art forms.
Yeah, so I'm like I'm open to all sorts of ways that people will hear my music, but there are certain when I listen to it and when I was composing it, I was conscious of patterns that I think broadly, I do anticipate that many people would hear these sorts of resonances. So things that sound descending motions, a really broad shape. So something that's trickling down, a little scalic figure, descending patterns. You know, we think about emotions, which are sadness, and there are certain cues and codes in music, which I think resonate broadly with people because of our shared human experience. So it's kind of tapping into those very big feelings. But then sorts of natural sorts of what we if we've grown up in an environment where we've experienced seeing a river or a waterfall, then the likelihood is that the audible patterns that I'm creating might resonate with those.
Since human expression's already been mentioned a couple times, I'm curious what drew you to highlight your specialization in composing for live composers.
So I like working with people. I am getting interested actually in working with some electroacoustic medium. Um, but historically, I've always worked with live performers. I like working collaboratively. I like testing ideas out with real musicians and getting that feedback from hearing something being performed, but also hearing what people have to say about it as well. So for me, it's really important. It's part of the rewarding experience of being a composer to have something played. I remember the first time I had something performed when I was first year university student, University of Sydney. I had a clarinet piece played and I cried. It was really embarrassing. Like not really, really obviously in the audience, but like because it was the experience of someone like a really high level performer playing my piece for the first time, bringing it to life, and I was so amazed. And it was an okay piece. I mean, juvenilia now, but I was yeah, it was very touching, because before that it had just existed with me playing. It was clarinet and piano, so playing it through on the piano and trying to imagine, but then that just gratifying experience of having something being played in a space by a real person who's taken the time to learn something and to put themselves into it.
So the draw to highlight this specialization maybe addresses two aspects. Is maybe what I'm hearing, that one, it's for living people as opposed to what up until 50 years ago that was kind of the assumption. Music was a living, you worked with living people to do it, but over the last 50 years the door's been open to not even, well, even most recent, needing any human interaction other at all than maybe entering a prompt to get music to be created. But then also it seems like it's separating out from I'll use this word, might be misplaced, but a more academic sense where you're writing music as an exercise or for oneself, that it's not meant to be there in the hands of someone who's living and interpreting and bringing it to life in a different way. Would that be a correct assessment of that?
Yeah, that's interesting because I don't think I ever, certainly not in the last 15 years, 20 years, have ever sat down and thought I'm writing something just for myself that's an academic exercise. I do work in a university and I write, I compose as research, but actually it's really, it's a double, not a double-edged sword, but it functions on multiple levels. So the music I write is intended for audiences. Um, Different audiences, and I will tailor my style to different performers and to different audiences. There's a sort of a range in which I compose, but I don't think I have ever in a long time, maybe when I was at university studying and writing exercises, it felt more academic. But I always think about having something brought to life and being performed in front of people. Mhm. So not so much as an academic exercise. I try to be innovative, but that can be quite a subtle thing. And not like I'm trying to invent a new chord or a new harmony or a new technology necessarily. It's about trying to, I don't know, it could be also about how I work with musicians. And so the innovation in what I do could be as much about ways of working with people, um, and then maybe writing an article about that. And that's how my composing fits in with my work as a researcher.
So I would imagine both these aspects that we've covered, the this preoccupation with gesture and the way you outlined it so beautifully for us, and this idea of the reason for writing the music and who it's being written for, undoubtedly these two aspects would have to have some shape effect on the shape of your creative process.
Yes, yes. So I have moved from being, I did use a lot of theory when I was a student, but I'm very much more along that sliding scale of writing instinctively now. And I think because I have absorbed a lot of the harmonic theory and rhythmic ideas and the influences of composers who I studied over the years. But I try to be much more spontaneous. And my working method now, which I like to write about, as part of my research, I suppose, is about my imagination and how I can somehow draw from that, think about the impetus, something that's inspired a piece, or maybe the idea that's come to mind, and then how do I translate that in a way which is kind of made sense of through this idea of gesture. Yeah.
So you have a creative process. I have a creative process. Most people have some kind of a creative process, but presumably there was a point else along the backlogs of humanity where that process was still being figured out. What do you think how do you think the creative process has evolved throughout time? Presumably started, I would imagine, incredibly unstructured, maybe even solely experimental. How do you imagine it may have evolved? Because, or maybe it's similar to what you're already describing, which is, sounds like you're talking about a lot of intuition, imagination.
Well, how far back are we talking about this evolution? What are you thinking?
As far back as we dare.
Well, I suppose people have music for different purposes. So whether it's a mother singing to a baby for the sort of the purpose of soothing a baby, or it might be for, music for entertainment, music for a purpose, for a call in a battle. There are all sorts of different functions. So, but yeah, this idea of a composer who's working alone it's like the cliche working alone at the piano or at the desk. I mean, that's relatively, the last few hundred years we've had that kind of ideal. And I mean, it's reflecting how our society, and it's reflecting, you think about musical modernism and inspiration in those terms of 1950s and 60s sort of music is different, I suppose, from what we might think of as being inspirational now. Like the quest for something then is different for what it is now.
So let's zoom into a more specific time frame then. I'm curious. I would imagine that, say, the advent, which took a couple hundred years, I suppose, and ubiquity eventually of common theory practices that was really prevalent in the 17th and 18th century, I would imagine that would have had some drastic effect on the creative process for people writing music in those times.
Right. So because they're not writing, that they're using systems and theories, they're conditioned by those, I suppose. They're working within frameworks, and is that what you mean? So
I'm just mainly just
it's not, you're not building something from scratch.
Exactly. I'm just wondering if you think that would have an element of truth to it.
Yes. So for me, I mean, I feel contemporary composers feel probably a lot more freed by the possibility that we can create our own systems, as much as we are still conditioned by, I learned common practice harmony as a student, and I still draw upon ideas of that, but I still feel like I'm pursuing something which is much more individual, which compared to someone 200 years ago, I suppose it's an individual, but there's a whole different sort of social context going on for a composer who's working a few centuries ago, and a different language, and what conditions that musical language has different constraints to the ones today.
Yeah, that brings up an interesting thought I pondered many times over the years, which is, what is the relationship, or maybe they're the same thing, between the creative process that allows an expression through music to be created and put down versus the systems that you're working within. So for instance, if I'm writing a piece that's in sonata form and in A minor, is that the creative process, or is that the system? And to that needs to be brought in some aspect a different or an additional creative process.
Oh yeah. So I think the greatest composers who, I mean, you could write. I have written sonatas, a sonata. I shouldn't say more than one, but people who we think of were great at writing sonatas, Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven. They were still really inventive, and you can hear the invention. I remember actually Augusta Reed Thomas said to me that one of the reasons she loves J.S. Bach is because you can always hear him inventing. And so a great composer will use whatever parameters or constraints they're working within and create something that sounds new and individual. So, I think a sonata and key, they're just particular parameters that we might assign ourselves for whatever reason culturally, or I might do it as an exercise, and then I innovate within that. So I think of those things as not as bad constraints, but as positive sorts of spaces to work within. So I mean, I can think of a few composers who still write sonatas, and they might be atonal. That's an interesting actual sort of creative problem. How do you write something that doesn't have a feeling of key, and you can still call it a sonata? You have to think quite broadly about the definition of sonata, I suppose. But it gives you well, it just gives you a creative um, constraint to grapple with. So that's where I think that's one way that inspiration comes from, because inspiration for me is giving your mind a problem, your imagination a problem, maybe sleeping on it, and then waking up the next day and thinking, oh, I've got an idea, I've got a way into this piece. Um, you know, that feeling when something hits you and you think, and you're probably not at your piano or viola or desk when you're trying to solve the problem. It might hit you 2 hours later, where it sort of taps you on the shoulder and says, "Oh, this is the motif that you could use," or here's a just a sound world. And it might be I get most of my inspiration from listening to other people's music. You know, that feeling where you listen to something, you think, I wish I'd written that piece, or I could do something a bit like that. That sounds like something that's a little bit akin to my musical language. And then riffing on the idea and then making it your own. I think a lot of inspiration is about this borrowing and references. Um,
So it seems like what we have on the table is systems, whether it's a sonata or a key structure. We have inspiration, but then we also have creative process, and that maybe those are all separate things that can work together, but are also separate items of what's needed to create some form of expressive art. Would you
yeah.
agree with that or disagree
Yes.
with that?
I think none of them are mutually exclusive. I think they can all work together. You could be a very system kind of focused composer. You could be an algorithmic composer and using L systems and creating like the fabric of a piece. But then you might cut that to a certain shape, and that's where more of the free thinking comes into it. So someone who uses algorithmic systems, for example, or just numerical series. I used to be really into using the Fibonacci series, like most composers do. You go through that rite of passage and doing that, and but I've shed that. But I do remember enjoying the feeling of scaffolding my thinking with even the most basic sorts of systems. Um, and I suppose those patterns now maybe have just become merged into my rhythms will always be a little bit asymmetrical because of the training that I put myself through. So yeah, systems, imagination. I don't think without some sort of system, whatever that is, whether it's just I'm going to write in A minor, or a form, or a sort of genre, or some sort of plan, there's going to be something, because it might just be something motivic. It might be the system is about taking a shape, and maybe for me that's where the focus of my system is now, is about thinking about kind of archetypal shapes and contours and what these things visually or physically in an embodied way could evoke. And that's the thing that informs how I can evaluate what I'm doing along the way. I think, well, what does this actually add up to?
You mentioned the Fibonacci sequence, which is great. Your rite of passage is hilarious, and that actually can extend. I wonder if for a moment we can extend the general conversation to include, or maybe a step out of just thinking about composers, but to jump out into any creators. And we've talked a little earlier on, we talked about some 17th, 18th century, the obligatory amazing shoulders that we as modern composers have to stand on. But now in modern times, I was thinking, even like Tool, I believe one of their first albums, one of the tracks on there was influenced by the Fibonacci sequence. So right away, it's like, oh, that's right. Maybe when we're looking for inspiration that drives the creative process, all this. But sticking with the modern for a second, and sticking with this larger viewing of general creator, not just composer. Do you imagine that, let's say you have someone who's living now and they're just discovering their artistic identity. For them, does the creative process even start as a product that's already shaped by the pressures of the established music industry and its capitalistic nature, as opposed to someone who lived 600 years ago 800 years ago, whatever, that the start of their creative process didn't already have these outlined metrics and things that was assumed?
Hmm. So do you mean that we feel the pressures potentially if we're living in a kind of a capitalist sort of, we need to make something that's going to please other people and potentially make money, or that it's going to, we're thinking about where what we do fits within what other people are doing. Because I think if that's what we're talking about, then there's always been some sort of pressure. Um, if you were composing um, before, J.S. Bach's day, then that was a time when composers were seen as servants, really, to they were fulfilling a sort of a role rather than the hero individual that we think about for Beethoven. Um, so I don't know. I think I don't feel pressure in that way. That I feel quite liberated, and I think that's partly the benefit that I have of working in a university as well. Like there is a kind of um, space to be. We're really encouraged to be very creative and not to fit into a mold or not to. But I'm not sure. Is that what you're trying to get at?
I'm imagining a young Jane or a young Sean, where we grow up, we've gone through our paces, we've learned common practice theory, but even before then, we probably had some
Uh-huh.
inclination. I know I have videos of me as a 4 year old writing, trying to write some music down. In other words, there was something there that was giving me a want to write. And I'm sure you have similar things, but contrasting that with someone who is living now, a 4 year old, 5 year old, whatever, it doesn't matter, but a young person right now, let's say they're exposed to music mostly through something like TikTok. All of a
Oh
sudden,
yeah.
immediately, their sensibilities of of the creative process is immediately tied to an outcome that is more tied to something like TikTok versus young Jane or Sean, that our creative process is based on this idea of our outcome is
Yeah.
a piece that's being performed at a concert because that's what we've been exposed to. And if those changes are actually there,
Yes.
does that actually change what the creative
Mm.
process can be for the people who are experiencing it now, versus even 20, 30, 40 years ago?
Mm. Well, I've definitely seen through my teaching students who come into University of Glasgow, there's definitely like a much greater influence of digital and the shift away from working with pen and paper and just in terms of levels of notational literacy, like there doesn't seem to be the same drive towards really investing in those skills and rather using digital audio workstations and thinking about production. There's a lot more people coming into university from a popular music background, it seems, and that's partly to do with how the education system in the earlier years is currently um, what's being encouraged. But yes, certainly in terms of just social media, and you mentioned TikTok, and I think that must be a really huge pressure, or not so much a pressure. It's a pressure, but also just an influence. And that's if that's what you absorb, then that becomes absolutely. I mean, we are shaped by our influences, and I think that can be a good thing, or it could be everyone has. It's just another constraint. Um, but I can see. I'm really interested in early years education and taking composition into a very early years environment. So I've been going into a nursery, a local nursery, and just trying out really play-based learning and thinking about its musicianship skills, but the agency, how a child can feel that sense of agency in sound, in playing with sound in the same way that they do with playing with paint and paper and making up stories, how you can do the same thing sonically. And so it's really just, I've been working really closely with staff there and coming up with lots of really creative games that give an experience of picking up an object. It could just be something they've foraged, like a tin cup, and then it's what you do with it and how you explore sound. And that's, I mean, hopefully that will have an influence because I see I see the impact. I have two children, two young 5 and 7-year-old, and it's very hard to get them off their iPads. And at the moment, they watch YouTube Kids, right? But that's all about short bursts. So I do wonder, does that mean that composers will show that influence of thinking in shorter bursts rather than the big, expansive time frames? That could be one thing. So, I mean, I don't want to be down on um, the times, but I suppose there are risks. And when through my teaching, I try to reflect and think about what the young people coming in, where they're coming from, and then just it's all about opening more doors.
You, in prepping for getting to chat with you today, a couple weeks ago, I came across a word in, I think, one of your writings somewhere that sent me on an amazing journey, and that is hauntology, which
Oh, yes.
before reading about it, I actually wasn't that familiar. And I would, in all the work that I do, I might do a very reductive version of framing it, that it seems like to me that the modern music industry has, just by its nature, created a fast track, that from the need to create to the medium, the method, and the release structure. And this fast track makes it almost obsolete to explore any different mediums, how something's recorded, what's recorded, and how it might be made available for someone to experience it. And that by getting rid of those exploratory steps, one thing that's maybe done is, this is why we have this cycle of everything's always the same, and we're in this loop
Ah,
of the same music coming out over different years. They just get repeated, as opposed to tapping into unrealized expressions or sounds that we might have were this fast track not in place.
so yeah, so I was introduced to this idea recently, like in the last year, really. Someone thought that they heard hauntology in a piece of mine, and it's a piece I wrote 15 years ago, and I didn't know the word back then. But it was a piece which used a lot of, I was thinking about palimpsest. I was thinking about layers and texture and resonance, and I suppose it sounded a bit haunted because of it was for two pianos, and they were sort of in dialogue with each other. And I guess they created quite a ghostly sort of atmosphere. But there was no quotation from the past. There was no it's about layers of time, is how I think about it in music. And when I next write a piece with the purpose of it being ontological, I think I'm going to imagine this idea of like excavating layers and then finding something which is evocative of the past. In popular music terms, it's been written about a lot, and there's an artist called the Caretaker, and he would that sound of the crackle of old records is a hauntological feature of his work, and making it sound like you're in a kind of a 1940s ballroom is part of the Caretaker's sound world. So just something which yeah, I mean the definition of hauntology is about a future that is promised but never actually arrives, or that never eventuates. And so something which you think was going to happen, and then yeah, it's a future that never eventuated. So I think about a lot of decaying, the sorts of optimistic big architectural structures which are in decay, and they sort of symbolize this idea of a future which which never came to pass. Um, yeah.
And so the way it was unintentionally used, and maybe in your music, and maybe how it will be used, is are actual sounds or specific sounds that bring about thoughts about something from the past. And then
Mhm.
there's this other side of it that I unintentionally found and dove into, that how does it actually change the future, to not allow it to be this, like you said, this promised future, even from the
Yes.
capitalistic or larger business standpoint. But either way, it's super fascinating topic.
Yeah, it's like the idea of the word I was trying to think of is thwarted, a future which is thwarted. And so, we 30 years ago we thought we'd all be living in space. and listening to really sort of electronica sort of music, and that kind of didn't happen. And maybe we're going back to being more guitar based. And I think popular music, I think guitars, they're coming back, and we're not going down the sort of the super modern space age. There's kind of a human need to re-engage with strings and resonance and vibrations of real acoustic instruments, I think.
Or maybe we got what we wanted or what was predicted just in different ways. We have two people stuck in the ISS who can't get back down. And we have AI creating all digital electronic music, even though it's meant to represent other things. But, well, that maybe is for a different conversation. But
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Well, I would love, where can people listen to some of your music and see some of your work
Yes,
and listen to...
Well, no, I've got my album is available on various streaming platforms, so on Spotify and Apple Music and various other whatever platforms that you have access to should be there. So it's called Cerulean Orbits, and it's on Delphian. And and I have a website which is janestanley.com, and I have a blog there which I'm developing, and I'm also hoping to start up a YouTube page where I'll talk more about music. Just for composers, sort of teaching page, teaching focus. So I'm not treading on your toes, don't worry.
Tread away.
But it will
Please,
be.
tread away. This sounds.
I'm very inspired by what you're doing, though. It's lovely.
Thank you so much for being willing to meet with me. I know it's a very different time of day for you.
No, great.
But hopefully...
I'm really pleased to do it. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it, and nice to make contact with you.
Yeah. I'll go ahead and edit it together. I've been toying around with. I'm trying not to do any editing. But either way, I'll send you a version